In this video, you're finally going to use React to render some content to the DOM. Currently, everything that's showing up in the browser is coming from our index.html file. That's fine, but the real goal is to use React to render our application. And in this video, we're going to take the first steps towards getting that done. Now, that means we are going to remove the text inside of body, and instead of typing the text here, we're going to create a template over in client-side JavaScript. We're going to define our template and we're going to render it right inside of the body of our page. Now, to kick things off, what I'd like to do is install React, and we're going to do this via a CDN. So I'm going to include a script tag, and that script tag, that is going to load in the React library. Don't worry, later on in the course, you are going to learn how to use Webpack to load in React DOM, React Router, Redux, and all of the awesome dependencies that we're going to cover. For the moment, I'm just going to use a script tag that's going to allow us to explore React without diving into a ton of configuration. Right here, we're going to create that script tag, and we are going to define the only attribute we need to define, the source. And we're actually going to be loading in two libraries. React comes first. So right here, I have a CDN picked out for us already. That's https://unpkg.com/react by the @15/dist/react.js. Now, I know that was a whole lot of stuff, but I promise we're only going to do this one more time, and then we'll never have to type a URL like that ever again. Andrew from the future with a quick update. This course now supports React v16. Actually switch to this URL instead. Everything is going to work exactly the same. You're just going to be loading in v16 of React as opposed to v15. Notice the path has also changed slightly, so make sure to grab this entire URL and swap it out with the source attribute value you just typed. I'm going to take this script tag, copy it, and paste it down below. Now, this is going to load in v15 of React. What we're going to do down below is load in its companion library. That is React-DOM. So React can be used in a ton of different contexts. There's React VR for virtual reality. There's React Native for native applications. In this case, we're trying to use React with the browser. So we're going to get React.DOM loaded in as well. That's going to allow us to render our React to the browser, to the DOM. Now, we also want version 15 of this. Inside of the dist folder, we're going to be grabbing react-dom.js. Andrew from the future again. Once again, you are going to want to use React DOM v16 since we're using React v16. So make sure to use this URL instead. So take a quick moment to make sure you have these two script tags in place. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a third one. We're going to load in a script that we're actually going to write. So right here, more script tag. And this source is going to be a whole lot easier than the other ones. We're going to define the local path to this file. So from the root of our web server, we're going to go into the scripts folder, which doesn't yet exist. That's okay. And we are going to load in a single script, app.js. Excellent. Now, before we go any further, let's go ahead and create the scripts folder and app.js. Now, remember, this path is in our HTML. This path is relative to the public folder, which is the root of our web server. So right here, we'll create a new folder, scripts, and in scripts, we'll add app.js. And this is where we're actually going to have access to all of the features of React and React.js. For the moment, let's just go ahead and save index.html and make sure everything's loading over inside the browser. I'm going to do that by cracking open the Chrome developer tools. The Chrome dev tools are fantastic. Going to allow us to debug and take a look at exactly what's happening with our website behind the scenes. Since right now, it's no content. So it's hard to figure out if it's showing no content because there's no content, or if it's showing no content because something crashed. We can go to settings, more tools, developer tools to crack those open. And I highly recommend memorizing this keyboard shortcut. It is going to come in handy throughout the course and throughout your development career. So right here, we have the dev tools open. Now, you might have opened up to a different page than me. What we're going to do, though, is just go to the console, and this is where we can type some JavaScript, view the output. What we're going to look for is the React variable, which exists and React DOM, which also exists. So React and React DOM are made available to us only because we included those script tags. These would not be around if we removed those tags. Now we can actually use the global React and the global React DOM to get stuff rendered to the screen, and that is exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to do this over inside of the file we just created right here, app.js. So let's kick things off with a little console.log statement. Console.log app.js is running. Here, I'm just going to add a little message, and that's going to allow us to ensure that the file is actually running. If I save it and go over to the browser, we have app.js is running right here. I'm going to take the developer tools and move them to the bottom real quick. Right here, I can customize exactly where they show up. I'm going to move them on the bottom so I can see the output in the background. Now we can go and switch back over to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to take our very first look at Jsx. That is Jsx, and it stands for JavaScript. That's the J and the S, XML. So Jsx is a JavaScript syntax extension. So it's not part of the core JavaScript language. As you're going to see in a few moments, the syntax is pretty strange at first. It is provided to us by React. So React offers us this great new way to define our templates and to inject our data into those templates. And it's one of the many reasons why React is so fantastic. Jsx makes working with your templates much easier than it was in the past. Now, you're most likely familiar with other language extensions. If you've ever worked with SCSS or less, those are just language extensions for CSS. Both of those, SCSS and less, add variable support, for example, something that did not exist in CSS and still does not. So these language extensions allow us to extend a language, and that is exactly what Jsx is. So let's go ahead and write our very first line. Let's create a new variable, and we can call this variable temp. Don't worry, I'm using var here, but we'll look at ES6 const and let in a few videos, and then we'll also using var altogether. I'm just going to use it for a few videos in the beginning of the course. So we have this variable template, and we're going to set it equal to something. Now, in the past, you might have set it equal to a string, like Andrew, and toss a semicolon at the end. Maybe you set it equal to a number, something like 102. Maybe you set it equal to a Boolean. You have all sorts of expressions you can set this template equal to. But what we're going to do is use Jsx. So that's going to look a little weird at first, but don't worry. The whole purpose of this section is to explore this new syntax, exactly how it works, and all the features it provides us. For now, we're just going to type out the following characters. So we're going to create what looks like the opening paragraph tag in an HTML document. Then we're going to go ahead and close that off with the closing tag. Inside of here, we're going to type some text. This is Jsx from app.js. Just a little message, and there we have it. You've actually created your very first Jsx expression. This little template is completely static, meaning that there is no dynamic values injected inside of it, but we will look at all of that later. For now, let's just go ahead and focus on getting this very basic one rendered to the screen. Now, we're going to render our little paragraph template down below by using one of the variables we explored in the console, and that one is React DOM. That's uppercase R, uppercase DOM. Now, React DOM has pretty much just one method we're going to be using, and this is React DOM.render. And this is where we are going to render our application. Now, React DOM.render takes two arguments. The first one is the JSX you'd like to render, and we already have that. Right here, we have template. And the second one is the DOM element, where you would like to render it. And we're actually going to create a new div in index.html just for this purpose. So right here inside of body, before all of our script tags, we can make a new div, and we're going to give it an ID, a unique identifier of app, and there we have it. This is basically the final version of our HTML file, even though clearly we have about 3 sections of coding before the app is complete. Almost nothing else is going to happen inside of this file. Now we have our div, and we have an ID on that div. We have a unique way to access it. So let's go ahead and actually access it, and we need to pass it in as the second argument to React DOM.render. We can break this out into a variable up above, another var, and we'll call this one something like approot, and we'll set it equal to, and right here, we're going to use the document API to fetch that element. If you remember, that is document dot And here we have options. We're going to be using get element by ID. We want to fetch an element by its ID, and we gave the div the ID of app. So right here in quotes, we're going to pass in app. Now we have access to app root, and that is the second and final argument to React DOM.render. Right here, app root. And there we have it. We have our very own little React application. We create a very simple template that we don't understand and know nothing about. Then we fetch our element, and finally we try to render it to the screen. Now let's go ahead and save the file, but be prepared for a bit of disappointment. I'm going to save the file, the browser is going to refresh, and right here we actually see we're getting an error in the console, and our template is definitely not showing up. Uncaught syntax error, unexpected token, and there we have the less than character. And we can actually click this link, go right over to the place in our source code that's causing the error. And you can see it's clearly where we define our right here. We have our Jsx expression, and Chrome and any other browser, it doesn't know what to do with. It's not part of the JavaScript language. It's an extension. So what we have to do is figure out how we're going to solve this problem. But we're actually going to solve this problem by taking our code with JSX and compiling it down into regular, boring old JavaScript. Now, if you've ever used one of those CSS extensions I mentioned, you know that you write your less code or you write your SCSS code, but in the end of the day, you're still compiling down to regular old CSS that the browser actually understands. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to continue to write code like this throughout the course, but we're actually going to have it compiled down into code that looks nothing like this, and that's what the browser is going to run, because that's what the browser understands. And we're going to do all of this using a tool called Babel. We can look at Babel by going over to babeljs.io. Babel is a fantastic tool. You're going to hear about Babel over and over again in this course. And as soon as you finish this course on and you go out and explore and create your own things, you're going to hear about Babel over and over again. Babel is a fantastic tool. It is a JavaScript compiler. Now, the most common use case for Babel is taking features from ES6 and ES7 and compiling them down into ES5 code. So imagine a brand new cool feature comes out in JavaScript, but you have an app that needs to support an old version of IE, for example, maybe IE 9 or 10. IE 9 or 10, they are never going to add a cool new feature like arrow functions, for example. But with Babel, we can write that new code using those new techniques, but in the end of the day, it's ES5 code that's running inside the browser. So we're going to be using Babel to do the same thing with our ES6 and ES7 code, and also going to use Babel to compile our JSX down into boring old ES5 JavaScript. To take a look at this, we can head over to the Try It Out page. The Try It Out page lets us type our code on the left and view the Babel output on the right. You actually can't change this code over here, and you can see that by default we're running in strict mode. We can, however, change the code on the left-hand side. We can, for example, use console.log to log a little message, test. Now, it's not actually going to log this anywhere, but it is going to show the Babel output code. This is the code that would actually run, and clearly nothing's changed. Console.log is a feature your browser does indeed understand. Babel does not need to convert this in any way for it to work. Now let's go ahead and actually type some JSX. So we're going to type out that exact same line we have over inside of our app.js file. We variable, template, then we set this equal to a Jsx expression. We opened a p tag, we closed a p tag, and we typed some text inside. This is JSX from app.js. Now you can see that we're actually getting something very different over here on the right-hand side. So console.log stays console.log, but our JSX does not stay as JSX. Now the first part did. Creating the template variable and setting it equal to something is indeed still showing up exactly as we typed it. But the JSX code right here, it's gone. It's been replaced with a call to a React method, react.createElement. So this is something that your browser does understand. Your browser obviously understands regular function calls. So we're going to be using Babel to take our JSX, compile it down into regular old function calls, and these function calls are what's going to be actually running. But we're never going to go ahead and actually write it out. They're super annoying to write, and React wasn't intended to be used like this. React was intended to be used like this. Now let's take a quick look at the arguments. The first argument to React.createElement is the tag exactly as we typed it over here. If I change that to an H1 in the opening and closing tag, it's going to change to an H1 over here. Let's ignore the second argument for a moment. The third argument is the content. So we have our text showing up. If I change that text to something new, that is exactly what's going to show up over here. Now that second argument, this is the attributes object. So remember how we added an ID onto our div and index.html? Well, we can actually add an ID on here. We're going to look in detail about attributes in JSX later. Now, we can type out something that we've already seen in HTML. I'm going to set ID equal to some ID, and now we have an object as the second argument with key value pairs where the key is attribute name ID and the value is the value. They're showing up here and they're showing up here. So if the browser is never going to understand JSX, how do we get our little example working? Well, in the next video, you're going to install Babel locally. For the moment, we can actually just take this code and copy it and paste it over inside of our editor. Now, this is something that we're never going to do again, but it is going to allow us to see the application working. Let's copy this, switch back over to the application in the browser, and inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm going to comment out the template that uses JSX, and we're going to take the output from Babel. So remember, we put this line in, we got this line out. Actually, we switched it to an H1, and we have something new, but it's still exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and save app.js, and right here we have something new showing up in the browser. This is an H1 tag, and it does indeed have the exact text content that we set up. So clearly the browser doesn't understand JSX. It does understand React.createElement calls. So that's what we're going to be using behind the scenes anytime we create a template. Now, this is one of those videos that actually creates more questions than it answers. What exactly is this JSX syntax? How do we do more things with it, like create more complex templates? What exactly comes back from React.createElement? We're going to answer all of those questions and more in this section. For now, though, we have successfully gotten a little application showing up. In the next video, you're going to install Babel locally on your machine. So to write this code, but have this code run in the browser. And that's what's really going to allow us to get productive with React. Let's take just a few seconds to recap what we did. In this video, we loaded in React and its companion library, React DOM, via script tags. Later on, we'll be loading them in via a different technique using Webpack. Down below, we went ahead and also loaded in a script that we created in the scripts app.js file. This script is very simple. We log a little message and we defined some JSX. Now, obviously, the real code that's running is the compiled version. We then have our element selected. This is where we want to put that template. And finally, we use react.render to say we want to render this template in this element in the browser. That is exactly what happens. Our H1 shows up, and it shows up right inside of our div. We can actually use Elements panel to prove that. I'm going to use escape to toggle the console closed. Right here, we have our div. Inside of the div, we have our H1. Everything shows up correctly. Let's go ahead and continue on to the next video where we're going to automate that process so we can really start creating some cool and useful JS templates. I'm real excited. In this video, you're going to be installing and setting up Babel locally. That's going to allow you to write JSX in your editor. It'll automatically get compiled down to React.createElement method calls and able to view the output instantly. So as we change our JSX, we'll be able to see those changes. We're not going to have to do any manual copying and pasting like we had to do in the last video just to get this simple example up and running. That also means we're not going to have any code like this inside of our project. This sort of code is going to be compiled. So we'll be maintaining this code, and this code will be the code that actually runs behind the scenes. Now, it's important to note that Babel on its own, it actually has no functionality. Babel is a compiler, but it's not going to compile anything by default. We have to add various plugins and presets in order to get any sort of change in our code. For example, in order to take JSX and convert it into createElement calls. Now, there are actually presets running on this page. By default, Babel shows us what our code would look like if we used the ES 2015 preset and the React preset. Now, a preset is just a group of plugins, and I'm going to explore all of that in just a second. For now, all we need to know is that if we remove React right here, we're an error. Babel is trying to look at this code, it is not recognizing it, and it actually is crashing. When we include React, everything works as expected. So what we need to do is include React preset locally when we use Babel, and that's going to take our JSX and it is going to convert it into create element calls that browsers actually understand. Now we can learn more about all of the stuff over on the Docs plugins page. The Docs plugins page includes various presets and plugins that are available to you, things you do not need to do anything with except install. So down below we have the official presets. We're going to be using two. First up, React. That will allow us to use JSX inside of our code, and if we click the React preset, we can view all of the plugins that are part of it. Now we're never going to install individual plugins because it gets pretty out of hand pretty quick. Instead, we're going to use these presets, and the presets are going to have everything we need. Here we have all of the plugins we need to actually convert that JSX. Now if we go back real quick, we're also using the env preset, which includes these three guys right here. This is going to give us access to all of ES6 and ES7 features that we've come to know and love. So when we include env preset, we're going to get things like const, we're going to get things like arrow functions, we're going to get things like the ret and spread operators, all of which we'll be covering later in the course. So all we're going to do is install three things. We're going to install Babel itself, we're going to install the env preset, and we're going to install the React preset. That'll give us all of the functionality we need for now. We're going to do all of that inside of the by running a couple of long commands. Over here, we can go ahead and shut down the server. I'm going to use Control-C to do that, clear the terminal output, and now we're going to install those three things. First up, we're going to install a global dependency using yarn global add. We'll talk about local dependencies in a little bit, and this one is called Babel-Cli. This gives us access to a command line interface to use the Babel compiler, but it does not come with any of those features. For example, ES6, ES7, or JSX support. So we're going to install this, and we're going to install a specific version that is at 6.24.1. And if you've taken any of my courses before, you know I always use specific versions, so the code you're running is the same as the code I'm running. This is and from the future. Once again, if the global installation command failed when using yarn 2 videos ago, it's going to fail again, so you'll just use the npm install command here. That is npm install with the G flag to install it globally. Still the same module, Babel-Cli at 0.24.1. You can go ahead and run that command, and that is the last global installation we'll be in the course, so there's no need to worry about these update videos from here on out. Go ahead and run this, and then you should be able to continue on with the rest of the video. If you run into any issues at all, just open up a question in the Q&A, and I'll get back to you right away. I'm going to go ahead and install Babel-Cli, and that's going to give us access to a new command. This one is called Babel. We can run Babel -help. This should print out a ton of output like you're seeing here. And if you are seeing this, it means Babel was successfully installed. If you're seeing an error like Babel command not found, that something went wrong, feel free to reach out in the Q&A. But if you are seeing this, step 1 has been successfully completed. Let's go ahead and clear the output. And now we're going to install those presets and env. These two dependencies are going to be installed locally in our project. So these presets, they don't give us access to any command like React or env. Instead, we just need their code to live in our project, so Babel-Cli can take advantage of it and actually use it to transform our JSX into those create element calls. First up, we're going to use yarn init. Yarn init sets up our project to use yarn. That's going to allow us to specify those local dependencies. If you've used npm before, yarn init is exactly the same as npm. It's going to walk us through a series of questions. It's going to ask for information like an app name. It's going to provide a potential default in parentheses, although you could always override that by writing your own. I'm going to leave it as the default, which is just grabbing from the folder name. I'm going to hit enter and move on to the next one, which is the version. We can use the default 1.0.0. We can leave the description empty. We don't actually need any of these values for our product. Same thing is true with entry point. No need to customize that. We're not going to be using it, and we're not going to be setting up a sort of repository system just yet, although later we will look at how we can integrate our React project to GitHub. Down below, we have author. If we want to, we could type something in like Andrew Mead or your name. but it's by no means required. And finally, the license. When we get to the end, all this does is it generates a brand new file in our project. And we can check that out by going over to project in Visual Studio Code. Right here, we have a brand new package.json file. We could have created this file, typed things out like this. The yarn init command just makes it a little easier to get set up. And you see all the value pairs we just specified over inside of the command line. Now, the whole point of package.json for our purposes is to outline all of the dependencies that our project needs in order to run. That's going to make it really easy to install everything. Now we're going to go ahead and specify our very first dependencies by running yarn add from the command line, but this time we're going to leave off that global keyword. I'm going to clear the terminal output, and right here we're going to use yarn add. Now we want to install those two we talked about. Let's grab the React one first. That name is Babel preset React, and we're going to lock in a specific version that is at 6.24.1, and this is going to allow us to install that dependency. Now we could go ahead and run this and then run yarn add again for the other preset, but we can actually just chain them together with a space right here. The next one is Babel -preset -env, and the latest version for that one at the time of this filming is 1.5.2. Now we can go actually install both of these dependencies, and what's happening now is very different from what happens when we install a global yarn dependency. If we head over to our project, we're going to see that a few things changed. First up, inside of package.json, we have a brand new dependencies section, which outlines the dependency name followed by the version we want to use. And this is really important. That's going to allow us to reinstall our app's dependencies with just this little bit of information. Now we also have, obviously, a lot of other things going on. What we have is a bunch of sub-dependencies being installed. So we installed Babel preset env and Babel preset React, but they have their own dependencies. They have their own package.json file. They have their own modules they need, all of that. These two and their sub-dependencies, they live in node modules. If you open this up, there is just a ton of folders inside of here. You do not need about any of the code in any of these folders. We're never going to go in there and change any of that. This is a generated folder that we're going to be able to delete and reinstall based off of just this information. Now we also have one more thing that happened when we ran that command. We have a yarn.lock file. Yarn lock is once again something we're not going to manually change, just like node modules, but it is worth cracking open. Now right up top, we can see this is an auto-generated file. Do not edit this file directly, and this out all of those dependencies that we saw in node modules. It contains the specific version numbers that are used, and it shows exactly where it got that package. And this is pretty useful for yarn behind the scenes. It makes sure that the code we're downloading is actually what it's supposed to be, and that also prevents any sort of issues. If libraries break, we can make sure that we're always using the specific version we specified. This is going to allow us to always resolve the exact same dependencies, regardless of whether we're installing this locally, on production, on a different machine, or anywhere else. So once again, yarn lock, don't change it. It's going to change automatically as we install our dependencies. Now we can go ahead and shut that down, and we can actually use Babel. So the whole goal is to create a file that we change, and then we're going to have another file get generated with the compiled code. So we're going to do this by creating a new folder in the root of the project. This folder is going to be called source, and this is where we're going to type out all of the React that's going to make up the Indecision application. Right here, we're going to add a single file for the moment, app.js. So app.js in the source folder, that's going to contain our JSX. App.js scripts folder is going to be an auto-generated file that contains this stuff as well as all of the other Babel transformations. So what I would like to do is take all of this code and cut it out. This file is going to be useless for our purposes, and we're going to save it and paste it here. Now we're going to remove that create element method call. We're going to uncomment our JSX code, and this is exactly what we're going to end up running. So real quickly, once again, this file is going to get compiled, saved here, and that is what our index.html file is actually going to use. We're never going to manually change app.js in the scripts folder. That's going to change for us when we run the command. Now we can actually go ahead and run our very first Babel command. First up, let's clear that terminal output. And right here, we're going to start off with Babel. Now we're going to be typing out quite a few arguments with me for the moment. Right here, we start off by specifying the path to our code, the code we want to compile. In this case, it lives in the source folder, and the file after the slash is called app.js. Next up, we specify the output file. That's the one in the public scripts folder, and we have to use --out file and we'll specify that. I'm going to set it equal to public /app.js. So by running this command, we're going to be overriding this file. That's why we're never actually going to change it, because those changes are just going to go away the next time we run Babel. Now from here, we do have to specify one more argument. This is the presets we want to use right here, --presets. Now presets is going to get set equal to a comma separated list of the presets we want to use. And we have two. First up, env, comma, second up, React. And that's it. This is all we need to do to take our JSX and all of our ES6 code and compile it down into something the browser understands. So let's go ahead and actually run this and see what happens. Right here, everything seemed to go well. There is no error output. And if I head over inside of Visual Studio Code, you can see that app.js in source didn't change at all. And that's expected. Running Babel is never going to change the code that we write. It is, however, going to change the code in app.js. Over here, you can see exactly what we might expect. We have the React create element call showing up instead of our Jsx. And this is not because we had it before. We deleted this file and we saved it. All of this was generated because we ran that Babel command from the command line. Now we can actually rerun that previous command using the up arrow key, but we can tack on another argument. --watch. This is going to watch our source app.js file for changes and automatically create a new public scripts app.js file every time a change is detected. When we run this, we can now leave it running in the background. And as we go ahead and change app.js in this folder, it'll change this file. So let's make a quick change. I'm going to change this text. Does this change? I'm going to save the file, head over to the scripts file in the public folder, and right away you can see it's already there. So Babel saw that change. In the background, it reran and it regenerated this. Now we're going to leave this command running for the moment, and I'm going to open up a second terminal tab. You can also open up a second terminal window if you like, and we're going to go ahead and start up live server here. So I'm going to clear the output, and I'm already in the Indecision app folder. You should have also auto defaulted there. If you didn't, take a moment to change directories into it. And from here, we're just going to start up live server exactly as we did before. Live server, and we want to serve up the public folder. Now this is automatically going to open up our web app in the browser. And right here, did this change is showing up. We could also go over here and just refresh this tab. Instead of having two tabs open, we'll just keep this one open. And there we have it. We have our code compiled automatically by Babel, and everything is entering to the browser as expected. Now that means if we head back into Visual Studio Code, we can actually start getting productive. We don't need to keep this file open, and we can start writing stuff over here. For example, I can change this to an H1 and add my app title into app, save the file, and in real time, that's going to show up in the browser. It shows up as an H1 tag, and it went through that entire process. So Babel saw the change. It compiled a new version of app.js in the scripts folder. We can see our changes are reflected right here. The live server saw that this file changed, and it refreshed the browser, and all of that gives us a really nice workflow. Now this workflow required us to install some local dependencies, so I do want to make a quick note about the modules folder. As I mentioned, this is a generated folder, and I'm actually not going to include it with any of the zip downloads, any of those lecture resources for the rest of the course. Node modules is going to look a little different depending on the specific NPM or Yarn version, and it's also going to look different depending on the operating system you're using, whether you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So it's important to generate this on the machine you're running the project on. So if we delete this folder, this is exactly what you're going to see if you download one of the resources. We can always get it back by running a single command line. It is going to go through package.json. It is going to reinstall all of these dependencies and node modules will look exactly the same. So to reinstall things, we are going to run a command from the terminal. I'm going to switch back to that first tab and shut it down. And if I actually try to restart it, it's going to fail. Here it's seeing that we cannot find the env preset. That's because we deleted the node modules folder where that code lived. So let's go ahead and fix that by reinstalling all of the dependencies. I'm going to clear the output and we're going to use yarn install. This is going to look through package.json and install all of the dependencies, recreating the node modules folder. Now we have our node modules folder back once again, and if we rerun that Babel command, cycling through our previous commands with the up key, hitting enter, we're going to see that everything is once again working as expected. So if you do grab a resource, make sure to run yarn install to regenerate node modules before you actually try to project. Now that we have an automated workflow all set up, it's time to dive deep into Jsx. Jsx is a real templating language. We can inject variables inside. We can add click events, all sorts of awesome stuff. That's what we're going to dive into next. I'm very excited to get to it, so stay tuned. I'll see you next time. In this video, you're finally going to take a deeper dive into Jsx. We're going to look at how we can create much more complex Jsx expressions with multiple elements, nested elements, and dynamic data. Instead of having static text in here, we're going to be able to put whatever we want in there. Maybe it comes from user input. Maybe it comes from the database. Regardless of where it comes from, we want to figure out how we can make dynamic tests. Now, first things first, make sure you do have editor support for Jsx. Here you can see I have a little syntax highlighting. This is provided by default by Visual Studio Code. But if you are using Visual Studio Code, there is a single extension I recommend you also install. If you go over to the extensions panel, it's this guy right here, Babel ES6 ES7. This is going to add better editor support for those features we'll be using throughout the course. I do have a few other plugins. None of them are essential. We'll be talking about some of them later. If you are interested, go ahead and install Path IntelliSense. This adds nice auto completion features, but the other ones can be ignored for now. If you're using an editor other than Visual Studio Code and you do not have syntax highlighting here, I recommend Googling your name followed by JSX syntax highlighting. So if I'm using Atom, I would Google Atom JSX syntax highlighting, and that should get you to the right page where you can find the plugin or package you need to install to add support for this. In Visual Studio Code, you should see that your file language is now JavaScript, in parentheses Babel. That's going to ensure that all of those ES6 and ES7 features are correctly highlighted. So once you do have the editor set up, we're ready to actually create a more complex expression. And let's just start off with adding another element. So currently we have a single H1. Let's say, for example, we also add a paragraph tag down below with a little more information about our app. How do we do that? Well, we're just going to tack on a p tag right here. After we open and close H1, we are going to open and close a paragraph tag. And we can type some text. This is some info. Now, if we go ahead and save this, the Babel compiler is going to rerun and live server is going to refresh the browser, but we're going to notice that we actually are getting nothing showing up to the screen because we have ran into our very first Babel error. So we can view this by heading over to the terminal. And when we do, we can see that the change was correctly detected, but when it tried to compile our code down to ES5, it completely failed, and it's showing us exactly what went wrong and where it went wrong. So right here, we have our syntax error, and it's coming from the file we just saved, app.js in the source folder. Here's the error itself. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag, and it's pointing towards that line where we create our JSX. So this is our first important lesson. When working with JSX, you can only have a single root element. Currently, we have two. We have an H1 and a paragraph tag sitting side by side. Now, obviously, we do have an H1 and a paragraph tag sitting side by side. We just need a single root element. We can actually wrap all of this inside of a div that's going to remove the error, and it's going to allow things to quickly render. So let's do that. Right here, before our opening H1 tag, I'm going to open a tag, and back here, after we close the paragraph, we're going to close that div. So now our two elements, H1 and P, they're wrapped in a div, and this is completely valid JSX. Save app.js right here, we can see that the change was detected. There is no error printing below, which is fantastic. And if we head over into the browser we get exactly what we wanted. We have our h1 tag with the text, and down below we have our paragraph tag showing up as well. So when we are creating JSX expressions, we can get really complex. We can include a ton of information and nested elements, but we just need to have a single root. So for almost all of the JSX expressions we're going to be creating in this course, we're going to have a single root div, and we'll be calling this the wrapper div because it wraps something else. It's perfectly valid to have side-by-side elements like this as long as they're not at the very root of your expression. This is completely valid JSX, but if we were to add any more elements or any more complexity, it would easily run off the side of the screen, and that's not what we want. We want everything to be formatted a little bit nicer so it's a little easier on the eyes. Now we can actually kick things off by just moving things to their own line. So for example, I can hit enter right here before the h1 opening tag, move that onto its own line. I can also do the same thing for the paragraph tag, and finally the closing div. And this is perfectly valid. If I go ahead and save app.js, everything still works as expected. Babel understands this. Now I'd like those divs to line up, so I can actually hit enter right here and indent everything. I can indent everything. This is going to allow everything to line up in a way that a little easier on the eyes. And if I save app.js, once again, things are going to refresh. This is perfectly valid. There are no errors. Now this is what I want. I want those div tags to line up, but I find that this looks a little bit weird. It's a little weird to have the template variable set equal to followed by nothing. So what I like to do for clarity's sake only is add an opening parenthesis right here, remove the auto-completed closed parenthesis, and then I add the closed parenthesis down below after my JSX expression, and I move that onto its own line. And this is the format I personally find the easiest to read. Now, I didn't invent this formatting style. If you look at the source code for other React projects, you're going to see a setup very similar to this with those wrapping parentheses, the root tags lined up, all of the other content nested inside. And we don't have to stop here. We could add more complexity to this if we needed to, which we'll be doing extensively throughout the rest of the course. So for example, I could add an ordered list, a numbered list of items. I can open the OL tag and close it, and I can put some individual list items inside. Right here, let's add one, item 1. We can then close that LI, and we can add a second guy down below, opening the list item tag, giving it some text, and closing the list item tag. If we save app.js, Babel understands this. It is going to compile this down to ES5, and right here, we get the expected output showing up. Now we know that this gets converted into those create element calls, but what happens when we have a complex nested structure like this? Well, we can actually look at app.js to see exactly what's going on. If we crack that open, we can see we just have nested react.createElement calls. So the div has the h1 and the p and the ol, and the ol has two of its own. It has one for each list item. And this is a great reason why you don't write your templates in react.createElement calls. This is basically impossible to read and update. I never want to see this ever again. So let's go ahead that file and forget it exists. We're going to be working with JSX instead. And for the very first time in this course, it is challenge time. If you've taken one of my courses before, you know all about challenges. If you haven't, challenges are where I give you a little assignment. I ask you to write some code, make some modifications to the app, and then you go off and you do that. You come back and you watch me go through that same process. So for example, I might say, hey, challenge is to change this text over to your first name. Take a moment to pause the video and make that change, test your work by saving the file, and when you're done, click play. So I'd give you a moment to pause the video. You would pause it, you would make the change, save the file, confirm the change worked, then you'd click play and you'd watch me go through that process. Now, obviously that's not a challenge, way too simple, but don't worry. The challenges are going to be outlined for you. I'll tell you exactly what you need to do, and they're also only going to use information you've already learned in the course, so you'll have no problem completing them. You're allowed to use the stuff we already wrote together. That's the whole point of the challenges. It's to take this stuff and put it into practice on your own. Real talk for a moment. If you skip the challenges, you're just wasting your own time. You're going to waste your time watching this course. You're going to get to the end. The videos will be over. I'll be gone. You'll try to make your own React app and you won't be able to because the information isn't going to stick you actually take the challenges seriously. The challenges are designed to get you writing your own code, making your own bugs, fixing those, and eventually getting the satisfaction of having actually built something your own. Now, I don't ask for perfection. There's going to be challenges you go through and you just can't get it done. You're getting an error, getting frustrated. That's okay. That's why I go through the process afterwards. I show you exactly how to get it done and I give you my thought process around that. So I don't ask for perfection. I just ask that you take all of the challenges seriously and you actually try to go through them, whether or not you complete them successfully. Now we're going to start off easy. We only know a few things, so we can really only do a few things. But as we learn more about React and the ecosystem, the challenges are going to get a bit more open-ended and a bit more complex. But for now, they're going to be a little more targeted and a little easier to get done. So I'm going to outline what I'd like you to do in comments right here. You do not have to write these comments. They're just there as notes. So when you pause the video and you go process, you can always look back at the paused video, you can see my little outline, and that'll just give you some direction as to what I wanted you to do. The goal here is to create your own template like we have here, and you're going to render the new template as opposed to rendering the one we built together. So step one is going to be to make a new variable. You're going to create a template to variable, and this is going to be a Jsx expression. Now this Jsx expression is obviously going to have some elements inside of it. So I'm going to give you a quick outline as to what elements I want you to create and what text they should show to the screen. So right here, what are we going to have? We're going to have our root div first of all, because we need a root element if we're going to have other elements side by side. Inside of that div, next up, we're going to start off with an h1 tag. And this h1 tag is going to have the following text value, your name. So in my case, I would have the text Andrew Mead showing up in the h1, much like we have the text indecision app showing up in the h1 here. Then we're going to create a few more elements alongside this h1. Next up, I want you to make a p tag. And inside of this paragraph tag, you're going to go ahead and add age : space followed by your age. In my case, 26. Then we can add another paragraph tag down below. This paragraph tag is going to be location : space, and you can just type out your location in whatever format you want. I'm just going to stick with my city name, Philadelphia. Now the last step is to render template to instead of template. So currently we're rendering the template variable. After you create your new template, template2, you want to go ahead and render that. Now everything you need to know in order to complete that is sitting right here. We create a variable, we define our elements, and we render it, and it's not cheating to refer back to that. I ask that you don't copy and paste it, I ask that you build it out on your own, but if you forget how something works, do feel free to refer to the things covered in the video. That's the whole point. So take some time, you're going to go through this, you're going to your work in the browser. When you're done, make sure everything shows up correctly. If you're getting an error, try to work through that error. And when you are done, you can click play. So I'm going to add about 3 seconds of silence right now. This is so you have to pause the video and then we'll come back. All right, pause now. All right, how'd that one go? If you weren't able to get it done, don't get discouraged. It's our first challenge, and the format can be a little jarring at first. Once we go through one or two, you're going to get a really good idea as to how they flow. I use the same kind of setup for all of them, and you'll be a master time. So the first step was to create that template2 variable and set it equal to a Jsx expression. So I'm going to do that right here. Var template2. I'm going to set it equal to a Jsx expression. And we're going to use the same formatting techniques we used above. It's by no means required, but that is the standard we're going to be using. So I'm going to open and close my parentheses, hit enter, and right here, this is where we're going to define our actual JSX. Now I wanted you to start off with a root div, so we can start off with a root div, and inside of this root div, we're going to be adding 3 other elements, an h1, a p, and another p tag. So I will break those out onto their own line, so I can toss those nested elements inside. First, that h1. Now the h1 tag should have a text value equal to your name. I'm going to use my name right here. First name, last name, either. Perfectly fine as long as you got your partial name in there. Next up is the paragraph tag down below. And the paragraph tag, I wanted you to use age : space followed by your age. I'm going to put 6 in there. And then we're going to move on to the last paragraph tag, location. Right here. location, colon, space, in my case, Philadelphia, in your case, wherever you happen to live. So that brings us to this point in the challenge. We've completed everything I highlighted. The only thing left to do is render template 2 instead of template, and I'm going to do that by referencing the template variable right here. Now that we've completed all of the code changes we think we need to complete, go ahead and test our work by saving the file. That's going to cause Babel to run, the browser to refresh, and it looks like everything did work as expected. Right here we have our H1 Andrew Mead, we have our paragraph age 26, and our other paragraph location Philadelphia. So hopefully you were able to complete that as expected. If you got stuck, perfectly fine. As we get more comfortable with the challenge format, you'll be a master in no time. In the next video, we're going to cover how we can inject dynamic data into our templates, and once again, there'll be another challenge requiring you to do that on your own. I'm very excited to get to it. So now that we have some more real-world JSX set up, let's go ahead and take things a step further. Right now, we have all of the tools to create a static website where the data never changes, but we're not here to learn how to build websites. We're here to learn how to build web apps where the data does change and it comes from outside sources. For example, something like a database, which we'll be doing later in the course. So what we want to do is pull out data like the name, the age, and the location. These should not be defined in our JSX. Instead, they come from variables that we reference. That's going to allow us to reuse this, for example, across multiple users. And we're going to do the same thing up above. We're going to break out data like the title and the subtitle. We're going to focus on this one together, and you'll break this one out on your own as the challenge for this video. So to kick things off, let's just start with this right here, the name, what gets shown in the H1. Currently, statically defined. The only way this value is ever going to change is if you go into the JSX and you change the value. That creates JSX that is not reusable. So instead, we're going to reference a variable right here instead. The first step towards getting that done is going to be to create that variable, and we can call this whatever we like. I'm going to make we'll talk about const and let in just 2 videos, and we're going to call this one user name, and we'll set it equal to a string. Now I'm going to switch up my name for a moment just so we can watch the data change in the browser. Now how do we actually use this string Mike in the H1 instead of our current static text? Well, step 1 is to delete the static text. We no longer want that around. And step 2 is to open and close some curly braces. Now this syntax should look familiar if you've used templating languages like Mustache or Handlebars before, but it actually is slightly different. So what goes inside of here? What goes inside of here is any JavaScript expression. So for example, I can use user name, the variable we defined up above. When we reference a variable whose value resolves to a string, that string shows up right there wherever you placed it. In our case, we put it right inside of this H1. I'm going to take a moment to save this. We can see over here that Mike shows up, Andrew Mead is gone, and if I change this to something like Andrew, that is going to show up instead. So by adding JavaScript expressions into our JSX, we can create JSX that truly is dynamic. Now we saw that strings work, but we can actually do some cool stuff. For example, this is a JavaScript expression, so I could concatenate on an exclamation mark to add a little bit of energy to the web page. Now we get Andrew with the exclamation mark. I could also take advantage of other things like string methods. I could call to uppercase, convert Andrew to uppercase letters. Right there, it shows up as you would expect. So we have all the to do a lot of really interesting stuff inside of these, and we're going to be looking at that extensively as we build out our applications. For now, we know one thing. If you have a string in a JavaScript expression, it just shows up. Now, the same thing is true for numbers. So for example, 26. Let's go ahead and break that out into a variable instead. Right here, user age, I'm going to set it equal to a different value for the moment. I'll use 27. Then instead of having the static 26, we're going to remove it. Now notice I'm still keeping age, colon, and the space. I still want that stuff to be static. I'm always going to have that text. I just want this part to be dynamic. Right here, I open and close my curly brace, creating a new JavaScript expression. Now I could just type out the age, for example, 29, but that's basically where we started, where we have that static value. So instead, we are going to reference user age. We can save the file. 27 shows up. Everything is working as expected. So there we go. Strings and numbers, when used in a JavaScript expression in your JSX, get rendered exactly as you'd expect. I'm going to switch this back to 26 and we can move on to the final one, which is the location. I'm going to remove the static text Philadelphia and instead reference a variable that doesn't yet exist, user location. I'm going to close the curly braces and then we can create it up above. Right here, var user location. I'm going to set that equal to a string, whatever string I want. To switch things up, I'll use a location I lived previously, New York, save the file, and right here, New York shows up inside of the template. I'm going to switch this back to Philadelphia. We now have a template where all of the data that changes comes from an outside source as opposed to being defined in line. This is going to be essential if we want to build any sort of dynamic web app. So we've talked about strings and we've talked about numbers, but what about something else like an object? What if we had all of this data defined on an object? Well, we can do that. Right here, let's make a variable user. I'm going to set up our object inside of the curly braces. We're going to add 3 properties, name, age, and location. Name will get set equal to the string Andrew. And we'll add a comma for that second property. Age, we'll set that equal to 26. And finally, location, I'll set that equal to Philadelphia. Now, if you reference an object inside of a JavaScript expression, things actually aren't work as expected. So let's take username and remove that and reference user instead. I'm going to go ahead and save things. And over here in the browser, we can see that it crashed. Currently, we have no rendered output. And if I go into the console, right here, we're getting an error. Objects are not valid as a React child. So what it's telling us is that you cannot just render an object because React has no idea what you want to do with that. Do you want to display all the property values, all of the properties with the values side by side? There is no behavior for rendering an object like there is for rendering a string and a number, but we can still use the object properties. So instead of user, I can just grab user name, user.name. Now we have a completely valid JSX and we're grabbing the variable off of the user object instead of the one right here. And I can do the same thing for the other two, user.age and down below, user.location. Now we're referencing all of the data off of that object, pretty similar to what would happen if we fetched a user from a database. We can remove these 3 and there we have it. We have our second template getting the data dynamically injected inside, and all of that data is coming from this user object. So we've talked about strings, numbers, and objects. There are obviously a lot of other types to cover. We're going to cover those in subsequent videos. For now, it's time for a quick challenge. What you're going to do is follow similar steps from down below, but you're going to do it up above for our very first template, the one that we're actually going to use as part of the indecision application. As always, I am going to outline what I'd like you to do. You're going to be creating an app object, create app object, and the app object is going to have 2 properties, title and subtitle, and both of those are going to be strings, and you can pick whatever value you like. We'll come up with good values later on. For now, any string value will work. Next up, you're going to use title and subtitle in the template. So the title is going to go right here instead of this static text, and the subtitle will go right there instead of that static text. And the last step is to render template, because currently template 2 is being rendered to the screen. When you're done, test your work. Save your file, make sure the title is showing up in the one and the subtitle is showing up in the paragraph down below, and use different values than these ones so you actually watch the data change. Take some time to knock this one out, give it an honest try, and when you're done, go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? This is your second challenge of many challenges. Hopefully you're getting a little more comfortable with the actual flow. So to kick this one off, I am going to create that object var app. And I am going to set up the 2 properties on that object. We can set up title first, and we can pick whatever value we like. I'm going to use some title for the moment. And after a comma, I am also going to set up a second property on this object. That's going to be subtitle. Once again, we can pick anything. This is my subtitle. Excellent. Now that we have the data defined, we have to actually use that. First up, the H1. Right now it renders the static text. We're going to be using a JavaScript expression instead. Now, where does our data come from? Well, it comes from the app object, but we can't actually render an object. We can render strings and numbers. So let's reference that string, app.title. Excellent. And we're going to do the same thing down below. right here for the subtitle, we're going to grab that inside of a JavaScript expression, app.subtitle. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and remove all of the comments you might not have. That's fine. And we can go ahead and save app.js to test our work. Right here, we missed the last step. I never rendered the template JSX to the screen. I'm going to go ahead and switch that up. Save the file once again. And this time around, we are getting the correct title and title values. Everything is working correctly. If we switch up these values, it's going to switch up what gets shown to the screen. I'm going to switch this back to indecision app. And I'll switch this one to put your life in the hands of a computer. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and save app.js. And right here, we get our title and we get our subtitle, and everything is showing up correctly. So that is it for this video. We now know how to use JavaScript expressions. We know that we can render strings and numbers. We can't render objects. That still leaves a lot of types. In the next video, we're going to continue exploring how we can use these JavaScript expressions to create truly dynamic and useful JSX. I'm really excited to get to it. I'll see you next.